Essentially, like, as long as you had 5 targets. Hey guys, what's going on? Shah here, and today we're going to cover essentially the latest beta build that was just released. We saw a lot of changes to different conduits for a lot of different classes. Most of these were nerfs, some were buffs, and they did a lot of restructuring of the Soulbind trees. Now, obviously, these changes that I'm going to talk about here are subject to change in the near future, so just keep that in mind when you're viewing this video as any kind of beta content you do happen to take a look at. So I just want to remind everyone of that it can change. So something big that we saw, now ignoring the kind of class changes, something that we saw was a restructuring to how the tree is laid out. What do I mean by this? So originally we saw that we're going to use the Forge Light Prime Mykonos as an example here. His tree originally had his bronze call to action at the very bottom as the last trait. And we saw that his middle row here, the charge additive and the Forge Light filter, were actually the top row. And we saw that the Hammer of Genesis, Sparkling Drift Globe Core, and the Soul Steel Clamps were in like the middle row. And then these two were kind of more towards the bottom. So just like everything just got shifted around. And this is a good thing for several reasons. This means that a lot of players are now going to have access to one of the more powerful traits in this tree. And when I say more powerful, like bronze call to action isn't going to like make or break a character, or like it's not going to be an insane amount of your damage or healing, but it's just kind of the more core ability. And then this stuff all remains more tertiary in the long run. Especially with this bottom row being fairly competitive, you now will have to wait a little bit longer to get it. But again, the primary ability, like bronze call to action, is going to be a little bit more of a primary focus. And same with Valiant Strikes. This used to be, if I'm not mistaken, one of the last choices. Some of the trees and some of the different covenants were in different positions. Some of the last ones weren't moved up to the top right away, but maybe they're in the middle row. I'm going to be covering that in a future video, and I'm glad I waited, because originally I was going to cover all of the Soulbind trees and go through all of them and which ones are going to be good for which tank and which path you might be taking. But I'm glad I waited, because that video would have been totally useless. So look out for that in the near future if you're interested on the different covenant choices. So if you are interested in that type of content, you can hit that subscribe button down below. It's no cost to you, and you'll be notified as soon as those videos go live. So now we're going to jump into these changes. All right, so these are the patch notes. I'm down at the bottom, so I'm going to actually just go right up to the top. So let's take a look at exactly what happened to some of the different specializations. So most of what you're going to see in this beta build was a lot of changes to Soulbinds. I think Blizzard, which hopefully by now, I think Blizzard thinks that they have most of the tuning modifiers and like the damage or the healing certain abilities do and the multipliers of that and the aura buffs. They have that figured out. So what they're kind of coming down to is the potency of a lot of the conduits, because a lot of these conduits are going to really define how your class plays or your character plays, or what certain abilities you're trying to capitalize the most on, whether that's maybe a defensive, or maybe if you're just trying to, like here, just trying to buff your rune tap as much as possible, or your blood boil, which is more rotational compared to being more or less of a cooldown. So the idea with this build is to fine tune some of the conduits. Now these might be reverted, they might get buffed in the future. It looks like a lot of these conduits were actually nerfed. Some of them were nerfed at their base value, some were nerfed in their ranks, some were nerfed here, buffed here, nerfed here. So like some of them are just going to change, but I'm going to try to quickly go through them and just talk about them like as quick as possible. I'm not really going to cover what the conduits do, but essentially all of the spec specific conduits, both like generic or like the potency slash endurance conduits, were pretty much nerfed here. So Blood Bond, this was nerfed. Instead of doing 5%, it's now 2%, and the multiplier is a lot lower. And this is to devalue the potency and the effectiveness of conduits, to try to, like I've talked about before, is they're trying to shift their focus from the Soulbinds being kind of the primary player power element to probably legendaries. Now legendaries haven't changed too much, and we didn't see any really in this build in particular, which might come in the future, might come this week, might come next week, or just down the road. And we're going to kind of assume that we're going to see us being able to possibly wear multiple legendaries in the future. So Just with that in mind, Debilitating Malady, this wasn't nerfed in its, like, its core wasn't nerfed, but the rank modifier was. They pretty much cut it by a lot. So instead of going all the way up to 10%, it's going to just go up to 2%. Hopefully this changes. I don't think this was a conduit a lot of people took, but it was nerfed in its ranks. Meat Shield was buffed, but the, like, this is what I was talking about. So this as a primary was buffed by, I mean, 100%, but the rank modifier was nerfed. Instead of capping at 8%, it's now going to cap at 5%. That's an example of one of those weird changes. Now, Withering Plague was, and then here's like that other change that I talked about. So Hard Strike now deals 15% increased damage to enemies affected by Blood Plague. And so this was buffed, and the rank multiplier was buffed in the smallest regard. So the base was bumped up, and the cap is 1% higher. So these are the kind of different changes you're going to see. You're either going to see all nerfs, a little bit of buff, half nerf, or just all buff. So that's what happened to Blood. And I think they also have some of these listed out in general. They nerfed, it seems, a lot of... So when it comes to the Blood Death Knight general conduits, a lot of them were... Some were buffed, some were nerfed, just like I just talked about. Abomination Limbs was actually nerfed pretty significantly. Instead of dealing 50% increased damage, it's now only going to deal 15. And also the rank modifier was changed. So this is really weird. It's going to go up to, I guess, 32, all the way up to 114, back down to 35. So I think this might be a typo, but we'll have to see. Finesse Conduit. Icebound Fortitude's cooldown is reduced by 20 seconds. This was a small buff, but the overall, like the ranking up of this conduit is going to be a lot lower, only 48 seconds. So Fleeting Wind was changed. It was actually, it looks like they just like removed it and re-added it as a new one. So Death's Advance now grants 15% additional movement speed, and here are the new ranks for that. And it looks like the old one they just removed. So I'm not sure if maybe they just like, I honestly don't know why they did this. Heart and Bones was also buffed in a minor way, but it was also nerfed in the rank up, so it's actually going to only stack up to 14% instead of all the way up to 15. This one wasn't too bad. Like, Lichborn isn't really a big defensive that Death Knights would use, and I'm not sure if this was a popular conduit, to be honest, but it was nerfed a little bit. The Impenetrable Gloom, Swarming Mist damage and dodge chances, so they removed the damage aspect of the dodge chance increase, so it's now 3% for dodge, and it's the damage increase is actually going to be 13%, so a lot more. So I think they want to make Venthyr a little bit more of a popular choice, and they changed also how it ranks up by a few percent. It's going to end at 1% higher. And they completely gutted the minimum healing of Deathstrike. This was a conduit that was insanely good for Death Knights because obviously Deathstrike is their main way that they mitigate, and having this do 8% increased healing was, the minimum healing being 8% higher was like actually insane. So they nerfed it there. Proliferation, this was the potency conduit for Kyrian. Shekelian Worthy is now, actually they doubled it. So the damage it does is increased by 20%, and it's going to scale up as well, and at the same rate that it did originally. So all the way up to 48 instead of 24%. Reinforced Shell. This was weird because the radius being increased and the duration being increased by 2 seconds, though they did nerf the ranking of it. Reinforced Shell is a really powerful cooldown that all Death Knights have access to, so as a raid cooldown, this is going to be pretty big. Probably a popular endurance conduit choice. Buffed, again, its duration, but they nerfed how long it's going to last at higher ranks, which isn't, I don't think, a huge... I think 8 seconds longer is insane. So that's probably, like, more or less a good change. And then Spirit Drain, more ruining power you're going to get from interrupting an enemy with Mind Freeze. This is good. I think Finesse Conduits should feel a little bit more valuable than they do currently. Previously, a lot of Finesse Conduits were like not even looked at. So I'm glad they are making it a little bit more beneficial. Now, obviously, this isn't super great in maybe like a raid encounter, but in PvP or Mythic Plus, getting additional ruining power with interrupts is just going to benefit the DK and actually can result in a higher DPS throughput, which I think Finesse Conduit should. I think like landing CC, landing any kind of kick, this would be really cool to see across more classes than just DK. A little bit of a nerf to Unending Grip, which isn't a huge deal. Like having super slow movement speed after being gripped in PvP was actually kind of horrendous. Nerf down to 48% and also nerf down to 20% in the at base value. And then Withering Ground, which is the not Kyrian, Night Fae ability. They increase its damage by 50%, which is insane because this should feel good, to be honest. Death's Due almost had no impact no matter what spec you were playing. So even Frost Death Knights who really don't want to put down Withered Ground would choose this Covenant, and actually just like not, because it was only resulting in like 2% of their overall damage, which is like honestly not even worth the global or the rune on. But having the 50% increased damage is going to be really beneficial, and it's also going to rank all the way up to 120% additional damage. So this one was a pretty big buff to the Covenant ability. But downside of this is now you have to choose this Potency Conduit, which locks you out of a different Potency Conduit if you're playing a DPS. As a Blood Death Knight, probably not a bad choice though in general. So let's move on to Demon Hunter. Havoc got a pretty interesting legendary buff here. I know on live they're doing pretty piss poor right now as in terms of damage. The idea is that they've always been a class that scaled off of borrowed power and have always had borrowed power implemented, and they never really had a core class identity. So they're doing poorly right now. Hopefully that legendaries and soulbinds and conduits and covenant abilities are going to help them. But this was a pretty big buff to the Chaos Theory legendary. When it comes to soulbinds, I'm not going to cover it because this is not a talk about Havoc. Demon Muzzle was buffed at its core to 8 seconds instead of 6. So the affected enemies are going to deal reduced damage. And then that modifier for the reduced damage was nerfed. So it lasts longer, but it was nerfed in its potency. So kind of balancing out. Soul Furnace was buffed by 100% up to from 15 up to 30, and its core was changed as well. This was an interesting one because like Demon Hunters are doing so much damage right now on beta as Vengeance that actually a lot of groups are running double Vengeance Demon Hunter instead of having 3 DPS because that's how broken they are. So seeing this change to the potency conduit, it's actually surprising, especially with the Kyrian Covenant ability. So I'm excited to see where this takes us because Demon Hunters deserve a little time in the spotlight. So Vengeance, kind of fairly decent buffs. Sinful Brand was nerfed. This is kind of an issue because Sinful Brand was a popular choice. The Kyrian one being buffed in a build that came out a few weeks ago was really, really good. Sinful Brand is a popular choice in more single target situations, and I think it still will be even with this like massive 200% nerf to the attack power bonus. Or the shadow damage, I guess, over the 8 seconds that it inflicts. But still pretty good when activating Metamorphosis applying Sinful Brand. So probably still good in raid. And I think that's their goal, is to trying to even out the potency of each of the Covenant abilities. That's something that I've talked about a lot on stream and in YouTube videos. Some of their Soulbind conduits, their generic ones, a lot of them, handful were buffed, handful for nerfed, again, similar to Blood DK. I'm not going to go through every single one. They changed Azurite power for some reason. That's weird. So Brooding Pool was nerfed. This was the the Covenant specific one to Necrolord. Growing Inferno, this one, the modifier wasn't changed at all, but the rank, they changed the very last rank to, instead of jumping to 25, just to jump to 24. I guess they felt like that rank 15 was doing so much increased damage at 25% that they decided to nerf it to 24. All right, Blizzard. They nerfed, I guess they didn't nerf, is that a one? No, it wasn't 15 before. It was 1 second before. So they buffed, I guess, the cooldown reduction that you can get at a base value for the increased scrutiny for Venthyr. But they nerfed the end cap for it, so it goes up pretty much 0.5% instead of going up a full percent every time, from 15 down to 12. Again, Sinful Brand was also nerfed. I'm not sure how bad that's going to be in the long run, but we'll see. Repeat Decree, this was a pretty big nerf because this is why Demon Hunters were doing so much damage, because the Kyrian Sigil was doing a lot of damage, and because of the cooldown reductions you can get from legendaries and talents, made it so you can like spam this instead of every minute, every like 30 seconds. So the damage being pretty much cut in half, or the repeat damage being cut in half, was probably a good change, and probably not too over the top. I think this was needed for how destructive that Vengeance can be when it comes to the damage meters. Shadow Resolve, Healing of Shattered. So this was nerfed just all around. Demon Hunters right now were able to just self-sustain like an insane amount with Soul Fragments, in pair with the potency conduit of Repeat Decree, because every time Elysian Decree did damage, it shattered a bunch of fragments everywhere, so that you like always have 5. It's insane. So them nerfing this healing was probably not the worst thing. Again, we have to test this out to see, but not too bad. And then the hunts, they ended up buffing. I don't know. I don't feel like they know what they're doing with the hunt, because the hunt is just like such an odd choice for Demon Hunters to take. They keep changing the ability. They are now buffing this conduit, so I think they're trying to bring it up to the potency of Sinful Brand and the Elysian Decree. But Demon Hunters are in a good spot right now. I think some of these changes were validated though, for how much damage and healing they've been doing. Druids we're going to skip, mainly because they got nothing. So they didn't do anything. They literally didn't do anything to Druids. Feral was touched, but mainly just in PvP. They nerfed the Ferocious Wound. Why am I talking about this? They nerfed Ferocious Wound, but it stacks higher. So I guess that's okay. I don't know. I don't PvP on Feral too often. So what's next? We got Monk. So Monk, similar story. Some were buffed at its core. Some were buffed via like the rankings. And then some were just like, had this like odd in between. So Celestial Effervescence was buffed at its core. And the rank buff was also, or the rank scaling was also increased as well. Evasive Stride. Heavy Stagger has a 2.5% chance to heal you instead of dealing damage. I know this one was broken at certain points on the beta where it was like just always healing you when you're in Heavy Stagger. That's no longer the case. I think this buff is going to be okay. I just don't... This is something that we're going to have to test out. Again, like I've said before, I'm not a huge Brewmaster player. On beta, at least. I am on live, ironically, but on beta, I just have really no interest. That I'd rather test some of the other tanks. This is going to have to be seen with some testing. Keg Smash deals 8% additional damage to targets affected by Breath of Fire. This is going to have really good scaling or synergy with the legendary that allows you to have 2 charges, like Storm Stout's last keg or whatever it's called, having 2 charges. So you can like Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Keg Smash, and get that increased damage. So Brewmasters aren't going to have as much of an aggro issue, fingers crossed, that they have in the past. And then lastly, Walk with the Ox. This abilities that grant shuffle reduce the cooldown of your Black Ox by 0.5 seconds, and the Stomp does additional damage. This is just a buff to a potency conduit, plus it's going to scale a little bit higher. The Black Ox being turned into more of a damaging cooldown just feels kind of weird, but I mean, hey, it was buffed, so you can't really complain. And then some of the general conduits. So Necrolord was buffed. We have the Finesse Conduits, Dizzling Tumble, so targets affected by Leg Sweep deal 6.3% less. That's such a weird number to buff it to. I guess it works with the modifier. So this doing less damage. This is a pretty good Finesse Conduit, actually, for tanks. So this being buffed to what it is now is actually not too bad. Leg Sweep becomes, though it was already defensive being AoE CC, like it's actually going to help them do less damage. Though I haven't tested this, and Brewmasters help me out if I'm wrong or right, or just answer the question, I guess. Does this timer start when they're affected by Leg Sweep or when Leg Sweep ends? Because that's kind of important, because if they're getting stunned for like the 3 seconds, that's only 2 seconds of uptime. All right, so let me know. I actually don't know that. So Fortifying Ingredients was buffed, both at its core and in its ranks, which is just good news. Same with Grounding Breath was also buffed. Harmful Denial also buffed. You're just seeing buffs pretty much down the list for almost every single monk conduit. The biggest critique that a lot of monks have been giving Blizzard is that their conduits were so lackluster, and also their legendaries are extremely lackluster. This is something that I hinted on in my last video. The last build that I talked about, they just don't feel good to use, and hopefully they do something to Monk soon to make them feel a little bit better. I think the conduit steps in the right direction provide a little bit of player power, but we're just going to have to see what happens with their legendary tuning. Fingers crossed is going to happen. I hope last week wasn't like the legendary buffs that they were talking about. Next we have Paladin. Paladin didn't see so many changes. They got a rework, or a reword, I should say, to Shining Light. Instead of shield, it's shields now. And that's pretty much it. PvP talents. General, not like literally nothing. Like so prop Paladins, similar to Druid, got almost no changes. So Paladins, I feel like they think are in a pretty good spot. I also agree. I think Paladins are in a good, righteous spot. No pun intended. Cringe. We're gonna cut that out. So I'm pretty devastated on Protection Warriors. So Warriors probably saw like the most change because they actually took out a conduit, which I've talked about in a previous video, and they added in a new one. So Fueled by Violence is the new conduit, and you are healed for 15% of the damage dealt by your deep wounds, and this is going to scale all the way up to 36%. This is pretty cool. Like, I like the idea that warriors can actually kind of have a little bit of self-sustain and healing, but deep wounds isn't like a crazy portion of our damage. So this is going to need to be tested. And unfortunately, they've removed Iron Maiden, which is a conduit that I talked about in a different video when I talked about a specific build to have higher uptime on shield block. They unfortunately just ripped that conduit out. I don't know why. I don't know if it's because people were trying to abuse it or if it just wasn't as effective as they wanted it to be originally. So they just removed it completely. So that video is totally invalid now. We saw a nerf to revenge dealing, making Thunderclap deal increased damage. So nerf, and then also nerf to the modifier. So just all around, both at its core and its ranks. And then same with the unerving focus. This is such a weird nerf because they kept the start at the same and they just scaled it up like 1% slower, like 0.5% slower per every couple ranks. Where it now just is 72 instead of 75. Kind of a weird change, but I guess 75 was too much rage gen. Blizzard, I don't know what you're doing. And then they got a lot of changes to most of their like general conduits, almost every single one. Some were buffed, some were nerfed. So the ignore pain one was nerfed at its rank value. The aftershock is reduced by 1 less second, and its damage is increased by 4. Cool, I guess. So this is going to have the increased damage instead of having a reduced cooldown. Originally, that's what it used to do. Again, they didn't change Disturb the Peace. I think this is a really good finesse conduit for Protection Warrior, but they nerfed the... they kept it the same, but they nerfed the end rank to, instead of being reduced by 15 seconds, it's now just going to be 12. So, it's not a huge nerf, but it's a small nerf. You're going to have to wait an extra 3 seconds to cast. All right, so condemns damage. It was fairly broken in a lot of dungeon scenarios. If you were pulling more than 5 targets and you were spamming your execute or your condemn, essentially that's what condemn does, is it replaces your execute, you would just get like an insane amount of damage prevented. And this was doing a fairly strong amount of healing. So what they did is they ended up nerfing the damage, or the damage prevented, by 4 times the amount. So all the way down to 2%, and it caps at 10%. So huge nerf here, and the rank changes. It's going to change this thing up to 3. It still looks like it's gonna have a cap though, which means like it's good. It's gonna be better in like single target situations, I guess, or like with 1 less target. But at the end of the day, like this is a huge nerf to condemn, because this is something that was making warriors like have like really good self-sustainability through absorbs. Nerfed Indelible Victory. Victory Rush now heals you for 200% of the damage over 8 seconds instead of the 400. It's going to only go up to 480 as well. So 2 big nerfs. Inspiring Presence wasn't changed at all at its core, but its overall value was reduced. What? Blizzard, like, why are you... This is such, like, fine-tuning. Can they, like, fix the actual game and, like, approach, like, legendaries, maybe? Like, 2% at max? Like, that's so dumb. So, Iron Maiden was removed. I've already mentioned this. It's no longer going to be in the game. It's going to be replaced with that other one that I've mentioned, which is called Fueled by Violence. There we go. So Fueled by Violence was changed or added. Iron Maiden was removed. Piercing Verdict, Spear of Bastion, instant damage and rage gen are increased by 25%. This is a good buff. I actually like Spear of Bastion a lot. I like my Kyrian Warrior. With Condemn being so dominant as a choice in going Venthyr, I like that the Spear of Bastion conduit's being buffed. Safeguard, again, nerfed. Stalwart was nerfed. A lot of warriors, despite them getting like this new conduit, they were like nerfed across the board. I don't know why. Like, warriors are performing okay right now, but I don't know why they're making these like small little minor changes for no reason. Like the end modifier being 2% lower. The general, like, some of these changes I just like don't really get, and they could be putting their time elsewhere. And honestly, warriors were never like broken. Like, there's other tanks that are way more dominant right now than warrior. So those are a lot of the changes, and I'm excited for a few reasons. So I'm a little sad. I am happy because they are reworking the trees in such a way where it's now going to be a little bit more impactful to have your tree at the start. So once you unlock it, it's going to feel a lot better having like Bronze Call to Action. And then some of the changes that they made to how the tree is laid out is really cool. Some of the routes are going to change, and again, I'm going to do a video on this in the future, talking about all the Covenant Soulbinds and which ones are going to be more beneficial for certain specializations, or I'm mainly going to be talking about tanks, but like which class is going to benefit more from a certain like tree. So I'm excited for the rework, and I'm glad they are making some of these tuning knobs. Some of these tuning knobs are needed. It's just some of them feel kind of like a waste, like especially with Warrior. Though I'd love to hear what you guys think about these changes. If I missed anything or there's something you want me to cover or talk about, let me know in the comment section below so I can address that. and I've always loved having some kind of discourse down there with you guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you're having a great rest of your night or morning whenever you decide to watch this, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.